everything. All right, so again, good morning and welcome to our last breakout session for this final day of our NIAPRS Executive Seminar. The session is entitled Building a Trauma Responsive Organization. My name is Daniela Labate-Cavelli, and I'm joined today by our presenter, Dr. Eve Addis. So before I hand things over to him, just a couple housekeeping things. All of the participants came in the room today with your cameras off and muted, and I would ask that you continue to keep your lines muted and your cameras off just because of the sheer number of folks that we're getting in the room today, just to make things a little bit more manageable. Also ask if you'd like to change your video settings to speaker view. You could do that. It'll just help minimize sort of the number of faces on the screen, if you will, and you can do that by hovering over the video toolbar with your mouse and choosing the Show Small Active Speaker Video option. So as I said earlier, this meeting is being recorded, and the recording as well as all of the slides will be available for all of you all today after the presentation, and you can do that by going on the NIAPRS website. You'll also be receiving information by email on how to download the slides and the recording. You'll also be receiving an email with an evaluation for today's session, so we encourage you to complete that evaluation for a number of reasons. One, of course, is we always want to get your feedback, and the other is that is going to be your mechanism for receiving CEUs. And we are offering CEUs for this session for social work CEUs, LMHC, and CPRP. So be on the lookout for that email. Eve is going to be answering your questions today at the end of his presentation, but I am encouraging you right now, and I will continuously be encouraging you through the chat box to type in your questions using the chat box. We'll be keeping track of those. And then at the end of today's presentation, I'm going to invite you all to join Harvey and Len back in the other room for closing remarks. So I'll be putting the link for that room into the chat box as well towards the end of the session today. And that link is also available in your conference brochures that you got via email and with your calendar reminder today. So with all of that being said, I'm going to go ahead and introduce Eve Addis to you. Eve has over 25 years of experience in community-based behavioral health and supportive housing program design, development, and management. Dr. Addis launched Addis Integrated Health Strategies in 2014, through which he's provided training and technical assistance for the implementation of best practices that facilitate engagement with high-risk or high-needs populations. Adopting the principles of trauma-informed culture has been of central importance to both provider organizations that are seeking to improve health outcomes and for people with complex healthcare needs. And Eve has worked with community-based providers and provider member organizations in New York State, Long Island, Rockland County, and the Hudson Valley. And in his own words, at the heart of my consulting practice is the knowledge, tailored assistance, and guidance that community-based providers often need to manage the inevitable tension between the business of healthcare and the art of caring. So with that, it's my pleasure to introduce my dear friend to you, Eve Addis.
Thank you, Daniela. I appreciate that. I want to start today, first of all, by thanking the prior presenters with really inspiring and stimulating information. I hope that I can do justice with my own. So I want to thank Pat and Drew for really getting the day started and getting our wheels and our hearts sort of moving and pounding in that order. All right, so just as an agenda for today on building a trauma-responsive organization, the presentation is really going in two parts. The first part is just some basic definition and terms, some background and science of trauma so that we all understand the physiology and the psychology of trauma. Some common understanding that we should all have about the prevalence and the relevance of trauma in the work that we do. So that's part one. And then part two is going to be more on the mechanics of adopting a culture of a trauma responsiveness and resiliency. So at the beginning, it's going to be a lot of more sort of technical information and then moving into more of the pragmatics. So here we go. So I'm beginning here with this COVID-19 because, COVID-19 is real trauma in real time. But I want to say that this is not going to be a COVID-19 presentation. But I'm going to be referencing it in some places during the presentation because it's really inevitable. But what I want to really do here is just kind of like go over some basic definitions. So what is trauma? Okay, most of you have had distress in your lives or stressful situations in your lives. And trauma is really on a continuum of stress and distress. It's both the experience that causes trauma and then the response to that experience. So we are all in the midst of this COVID-19 experience, and how we're responding to that event is trauma. Now, a traumatic event is one in which a person directly experiences or witnesses actual or threatened death, serious injury, or a threat to physical integrity of self or other. Keep in mind here that, again, with COVID, we're living under this threat. The other trauma that we're all hearing about is that which firsthand repeated exposure of first responders, counselors, trauma therapists, all the people who we work with, who are out there in the field and who are managing during this time. So from the perspective of COVID, and again, this isn't a COVID presentation, but keep in mind that we are dealing with a reality as I'm speaking with you. So this really begins with a study 25 years ago. And I want to say that this study revolutionized the way we, as a culture, really, and certainly in the behavioral health world, and even in the primary care world, understand stress and how it impacts people through the life cycle. So the A study, very briefly, took place between 1995 and 1997, and looked at 17,000 people in an HMO in Southern California, and had them all answer 10 questions where they were asked to identify whether they had experienced those 10 situations of adversity. And just for the record, the participants in this study were 54% female, 46% male, almost 75% white, 4.5% Black, and 11.2% Hispanic. So this was really a largely white population and fairly middle class. So keeping that in mind, they all took part in this 10 statements questionnaire, and they were to identify which ones they had experienced. So the score on the questionnaire would be from 1 to 10. And what's important here is that the results of this study really began to change the way people think about stress and distress and how it impacts people's lives. So according to the CDC, they found that ACEs were very common. And as this study has been replicated a number of times, the results mirrored the original study findings. And those are that about 61% of adults surveyed across 25 states reported that they had experienced at least one type of ACE, and nearly 1 in 6 reported they had experienced 4 or more. And this number 4 is going to become more relevant as I move on, because it's an important indicator So if somebody has experienced 4 out of the 10, what does that look like in terms of their mental health, behavioral health, and physical health? The other finding is that exposure to ACEs is associated with 1.9 million cases of heart disease and 21 million cases of depression. So here we see the beginnings of kind of the connection and the connecting the dots between adverse childhood experiences and physical and behavioral health disorders. And then finally, that women and several racial ethnic minority groups were at greater risk for having experienced 4 or more ACEs. So let's look at ACEs now in terms of a couple of things. So first of all, when we talk about adverse childhood experience, we're talking about a particular type of trauma, one that has developmental implications, and one that functions depending on the age of onset and the duration. So keep this in mind, because when we talk about adverse childhood experiences, and then when we talk about stress and distress, these things could interact in a way where you have a kind of a foundation of trauma on which other stressors can play a very destructive role. So let's look at what the experience and aftermath of traumatic stress is. So here we have helplessness, anxiety, uncertainty, depression, physical discomfort, and pain. And keep in mind that right now we are living in all of these. What again, referring to COVID, we are all living with these experiences. And how it's expressed is then a matter of what the behaviors are that we might see in someone who's been impacted by trauma or a high level of distress. And these are symptoms really that are common in other kinds of disorders, but certainly here we see them as hypervigilance, sleep disorder, or insomnia, withdrawal, aggression, mood dysregulation, addiction, and suicide. And we're already beginning to see now these days some upticks in certain kinds of social behavioral issues. We're seeing an uptick in depression, we're seeing an uptick in addiction, and I heard also in domestic violence. So again, this isn't, you know, I want to kind of not get too COVID focused, but again, one can't really avoid bringing that in as part of this conversation. So let's see what it looks like. So trauma is experienced on a continuum of distress mitigated by resilience. Now, what do I mean by that? Oh, wait a minute. Yeah. Okay. So what do I mean by that? Now, you see these 2 arrows on this slide, and these 2 arrows are not necessarily, how shall I put this? They're not necessarily in an inverse relationship, but what we have is the continuum between normal stress and going to extreme distress or traumatic distress. And on the other green arrow, you see a resilience continuum. So basically what this is kind of wants to, what I'm trying to show here is that the greater the resilience that a person has, and these are what I refer to as protective factors. These are the things that a person brings to any situation that represent their strengths or that represents their prior experience that prepares them to deal with an adverse situation. So the higher the resilience, of course, the more the person is able to manage extreme distress. When we talk about early childhood experiences and the developmental implications, is that usually the individual doesn't have the opportunity to build resilience. And so as they grow and mature, they are limited in the way that sort of they are easily triggered by stressful situations. In adulthood, where stress is being managed without the childhood distress or the childhood trauma background, we are then dealing with a person's experience and a person's having managed stress, or a person's having been able to develop strengths that would help them deal with extreme stress. So, you know, this is a dynamic that exists between the experience or the exposure to trauma and the resilience or the protective factors that a person brings to any situation, any stressful situation. So let's look at it now with a little bit more, I guess, anatomically, if you will. So this is a way of kind of getting a sense of how, what happens in the body when a person experiences stress, distress. So this triggers the primitive brain, the amygdala. And the amygdala is there in a way to protect us, and it's kind of the alarm system, or the brain's alarm system, to let us know that we have to mobilize in the face of danger, and in order to survive. This is our survival alarm. And what the amygdala does is immediately releases mobilizing stress hormones. Cortisol, adrenaline are some of those hormones, and it's to help prepare us to manage this threat, or this potential damaging force coming our way. And when this happens, the prefrontal cortex, which is our thinking brain, shuts down. And there's a reason for that, because the brain wants immediate action in the face of danger. So the thinking brain doesn't operate at that point. It really is blocked off. And we are in a place now where we are in a quick response to a danger. So some of the body experiences may be tightening of the chest, a rapid heartbeat, shortness of breath, gastric pain, but something is happening in the system that's letting us kind of, certainly the hormones, the stress hormones are pumping oxygen into our bloodstream. That's why we're breathing more rapidly, and why our heartbeat is more rapid as well. And this kind of moves us into what's known as the fight, flight, or freeze response. So this is, we're either going to fight that threat, we're going to run as fast as we can away from it against survival, or the last one, which is freeze, which is probably the immobilizing aspect of this rapid release of stress hormones. And when we're in this fight, flight, or freeze, we are really in either a state of hyperarousal, which is experienced as anxiety or the fight response, aggression, or hypoarousal, which at the opposite extreme, where there is numbness, depression, and basically an inability to move. And this looks like in life, in a person, this might look like a person who's experiencing a sleep disturbance. It might look like obesity, hypertension, again, substance abuse, and suicide. Now, what is important is that these experiences, if they are left unresolved, the individual who's been through this is very highly susceptible to re-traumatization. And another way of saying this is the trigger, the person being easily re-triggered um, to a state of fight, flight, or freeze by stimuli in the environment or by experiences in the environment that that recreate that feeling of threat, and then the cycle then repeats itself. So this is kind of an overview, which is important because if one is to sort of understand this, then one can kind of look at organizationally where we are. We have an organization with policies, procedures, and systems that may be re-traumatizing or re-triggering. So the question that usually comes up at this point is saying, okay, well, why be trauma responsive? And I think that the prevalence here is important to understand, because this isn't something that's happening sort of over there, that we can kind of look at it and say, well, it's really not about us. So let's look at it in the lives of the people we serve. Individuals diagnosed with serious mental illness, 90% plus report a history of trauma. Individuals with serious mental illness report experiencing more abuse in childhood and are more likely than the general population to be victimized in adulthood. 75% of individuals seeking treatment for a substance use disorder have been exposed to or experienced a traumatic event in their lives. And 3 to 4 individuals seeking mental health services have experienced some type of childhood abuse or neglect. And finally, and not least, is the poverty, racism, hunger, chronic homelessness, growing up with domestic violence, mental illness, or with substance abuse, all have greater exposure to trauma. So I think it's pretty clear that we are not, how shall I say, looking at something that isn't pretty prevalent in the lives of the people that come to us for healing. Now, if we look in our own lives and the lives of the frontline behavioral health workforce, let's generally see that 50% of adults have experienced or been exposed to violence, a kind of traumatic experience. With youth, 70% of youth have experienced physical assault in their lifetime, and 72% have witnessed violence in home or a community, and not in war, but just simply on the streets. In this country, a report of child abuse is made every 10 seconds. Now, again, just dropping in a word about COVID, 45% of US adults reported negative impact on mental health due to COVID-19 worry and stress. And this is from the Kaiser Family Foundation, a poll that was conducted last month. And one other that has to do with social distancing is the widespread experience of loneliness is viewed as a public health concern that poses greater risk for both mental and physical health. This was a finding that was released in 2017, but in terms of our current experience, there are lots of people who are alone right now, and I just think that we are facing a tremendous challenge when things get back to normal. So this prevalence, sort of these areas of prevalence, I think make the point that how can we be in a business, if you will, that that helps people manage their lives without being trauma responsive. So getting back to this ACEs, and I want to, get back to that. I mentioned before that, an ACE of 4, that is, in looking at the 10 areas of adversity on the ACE questionnaire, having 4. So having 4 ACEs out of 10 increases the risk by 240% of contracting hepatitis, 400% increased risk of emphysema. And you can kind of look at the sort of the underlying mechanisms for those. A 460-degree risk of depression, a 1,200% increased risk of suicide, and then IV drug use, an even higher risk. And keep in mind now we're talking about adverse childhood experience, and remember here we're talking about a developmental impact as well, in that a person who's experienced adverse relationships or adverse environment in childhood is likely not to develop the kinds of strengths and the kind of protective factors that would help them manage stress later on in life. So there are those developmental implications. And here you see the kind of the pyramid that experience in early childhood results in a social, emotional, and cognitive impairment, the adoption of high-risk behaviors, which also may be related to the hepatitis and the emphysema risks I spoke of a few minutes ago. And then, disease, disability, social problems, criminality, and then finally, early death. And interestingly enough, we know, being in the behavioral health field, how early death is also a function for people who have serious mental illness, if interventions are not specific and timely. And so there are some parallels between trauma and mental illness, at least in shortening people's lives. So let's look at attribution here, because like prevalence and like the kind of risk factors, I wanna say here that if we look at depression, for example, we are looking at an attribution of 50% could be attributed to trauma. Suicide, 58% of suicidality can be attributed to trauma, and so on. You see a 78% attribution of trauma in IV drug use. So again, prevalence, impact, risk, it's all within the domain of the work that we do, and how can we escape the connection between trauma and some of what we see, and certainly the suffering that we see in the people that we serve. So why be trauma responsive? So given the prevalence and the relevance of trauma, both in the people that we serve and in the people who serve them, our workforce is certainly not kind of exempt, and we need to be, as we're looking at this issue of trauma, we need to be paying attention not only to the people we serve, but also the people, our workforce, because after all, we are, as organizations, nothing without our workforce. So why be trauma responsive? Yes, to deliver services that meet the prevalent needs of the people we serve, to empower the workforce with skills that meet the prevalent needs of the people we serve, to improve engagement between our workforce and the people they serve, engagement being the key to healing, engagement being the key to good health outcomes for the people that we serve. We want to improve behavioral and primary health outcomes for the people that we serve. We want to prevent workforce burnout. We want to enhance workforce loyalty and retention. And here it's really just a matter of, with a better skill set and with a better understanding of who the people are that they are working with, a workforce is much likely to be more satisfied with their work and with the organization that allows them to do the work. With engagement, we have better continuity of care in ways to prevent, if we're trauma responsive, we're preventing re-traumatization and potential withdrawal from care that people may experience when an organization or a place that they're coming to for help doesn't recognize and try to help them manage their lives in a trauma responsive way, to promote recovery. And here, as I was listening this morning to Pat Deegan's presentation, I wish we could have had a dialogue, because so much of what she presents and what we understand as recovery is not that sort of distinct from what we know and what we try to do in terms of being trauma responsive. And generally, and lastly, and now, again, because of what we're all going through, the importance of having organizational and workforce resilience right now, and I think that probably every organization, at least that I've been talking to, is really examining their own resilience in the face of this tremendous challenge. So now we get to part two. So I think, what is it now, having this understanding, what is the mechanic? What are the mechanics? How do we do this? How do we become trauma responsive? And let's take a dive into that and see that we begin with 4 steps. And I couldn't think of a better word than steps, but they're really kind of 4 things, if you will, that an organization has to acknowledge and has to be ready for. And let me say that this is very different when we're talking about adopting a trauma responsive culture. This is not a one-off proposition. This is not, sending some staff to for a half-day trauma-informed care training or a self-learning module. In order to truly become trauma responsive, the organization has to have an understanding and appreciation of the prevalence of trauma in the healthcare universe, both from the perspective of behavioral health and the perspective of physical health. The organization has to have an understanding and an appreciation of the relevance of trauma-responsive culture for improving both health outcomes in the people they serve with complex care needs and the people who they hire and who is their workforce. Leadership buy-in is crucial, and because it's leadership that has to sort of exemplify a willingness to examine their own organizational management and clinical operation through a trauma responsive lens. So this is really an in-depth review and willingness to change some things that exist in the organization that are not trauma responsive to make them more trauma responsive. And then, last but not least is development of a strategic change process towards trauma responsiveness that includes mechanisms for continuous improvement and sustainability. Because the system is not static. Things change, policies change, you know, everything in our world, and we've seen that in the last few years, has the potential for requiring change. And as these changes come to us, we have to be able to dissect them and make sure that how they are being expressed in our own worlds, in our own organizations, are trauma responsive. So there needs to be something alive in the organization that continues to do that over time, and as change is required from other areas, that those changes are then put through the same rigorous review for trauma responsiveness. So the key principles of a trauma responsive culture are safety, trustworthiness and transparency, choice, collaboration and mutuality, and empowerment and self-care. Now, if you look at these, you know, in particular, what sort of pops out are, you know, choice, collaboration, and empowerment, and how similar this is to recovery, and how these two concepts, recovery and trauma responsiveness, really are in tandem, in that you know, you really can't be one without the other. You have to have a recovery mindset to begin with as a foundation in order to begin to incorporate principles of trauma responsive culture. And safety, and we're going to get into more depth around these and how that, what they look like in a trauma responsive organization. But certainly, if you look at all of these, you get a sense that they're all designed really to minimize re-traumatization and re-triggering, to allow people to heal and to allow people to take advantage of the services and the healing efforts of the people that are there to attend to them. So when we're talking about applying these principles, and this is why those 4 steps at the beginning of this part of the presentation are so important to buy in particular, because the implementation of those 4 or those 5 principles have to kind of find their way into governance and leadership, into policies and procedures, into the physical environment, in engagement and involvement, cross-sector collaboration, in the screening, assessment, and treatment processes, in training and workforce development, in monitoring and quality assurance, in financing, and in evaluation. So again, this is a very in-depth, this is a very kind of into the weeds change process that affects every aspect of an organization's function, from the bricks and mortar of the organization all the way to the kind of philosophy and you know, the less tangible aspects of how an organization works. And so when we talk about culture here, we have to go through an implementation and bringing trauma responsive approaches to all aspects of the organization. So let's look at this now a little bit in terms of you know, how this would work. And we're going to look at least 4 of these domains. So the first one is leadership and agency commitment. So there would have to be a trauma leadership team, and this team would be sort of the vehicle for the change process, but would continue in the organization for that, you know, continuous improvement and sustainability. Trauma-informed culture and trauma-informed care would be written into the agency mission and into program description. So it becomes really part of the kind of embedded in the organization and that also people with lived experience have leadership roles. Again, this is another aspect of a recovery-based organization. But with regard to leadership and agency commitment, this really has to come from the top, and it has to be reinforced at all times from the top. If we look at now more of the environment, safety in the environment, we have to look at the physical space. Does it really feel safe? Does it give somebody coming in a sense of comfort and a sense of peace? Does it give a person a sense of being welcomed? Then, from the perspective of that person with a trauma background, do they feel safe in knowing that the staff is equipped to deal with crisis? Would they feel safe in an environment where they actually sense that, and they've witnessed staff in action in being able to address a crisis situation? And that also that they know that people like themselves who come for services, who come to receive services, have a voice, and that their approach and their experiences are valued in terms of how the organization creates a safe environment. If we look at workforce development and looking at that through a trauma responsive lens, we'd have to ensure that all staff are trained on trauma responsive culture. We'd have to decide how often we want this training. We'd have to have an appreciation of workforce trauma and have a response to that. So in this environment, I would ask, what are organizations doing to address their own workforce at a time of COVID-19? There would have to be training for staff on responding to reactivity, both in terms of the potential reactivity of people who are seeking services, but also reactivity of staff who may be triggered in their own way. Trauma responsive supervision is a whole other kind of training for supervisors in being able to, again, build resilience in the workforce and ensure that the staff are being trauma responsive in their interactions with the clients, the people they serve. And also trauma responsiveness as part of hiring and performance review. So it's sustained, and so people coming into an organization as part of the workforce understand what will be expected of them, and then that their performance reviews ensure that people are applying the principles of trauma responsive care in their work. In terms of services and service delivery, well, I can't really emphasize too much what the importance is of the first point of contact around engagement. We all know that so many people elude care because the environment in which care is provided is very often in itself re-triggering, and so people stay away. So that first point of contact has to be rigorously reviewed to ensure that it's welcoming and engagement. Rules, policies related to rules, and I see this myself when I'm working in organizations, and I come into the place and I'm struck by how many things in the waiting room are expressed, signs of what you can do and what you can't do, are expressed in ways that are more punitive sounding and that are not really responsive to what the experiences of somebody coming in to a waiting room in a state of anxiety and uncertainty, and they look around and they see a lot of signs that just say no smoking, no eating, no cell phones. and how that could be very discouraging and actually alienating. So that sometimes I find that the people who need the care the most are really the people who are not being kind of recognized in a trauma responsive way. Peer support, of course, is part of, again, the recovery approach to care, but it's also very important in a trauma responsive environment. And cross-system collaboration, so that as people are perhaps attending one place for services and care, and they're referred to another, and it's important to try to get the system of care to be more trauma responsive. And last but not least, how are we kind of retriggering people, looking at how we're retriggering people with an intake process that may be too intrusive, or that may be too impersonal, and that doesn't allow in those first moments of meeting the practice or the practitioner for engagement, but rather the emphasis being more on collecting data. I think that that's an issue that has come up for me in working with organizations on more than one occasion. And I want to kind of focus on that for a minute, because that first encounter is critical. And so, you know, creating an intake checklist, this isn't something that you would do necessarily, but to kind of examine your intake process, that first encounter. So, you know, beginning with access, you know, was it easy to schedule an appointment? Are same-day appointments available? Are appointments available on evenings and weekends? Again, because we have to be sensitive to the fragility of someone who expects to have a negative encounter. And so the ease with which they can engage with assistance is very important. Once they're there, what does reception look like? The people who are conducting reception friendly and courteous? Is the registration process simple? Too many forms, not offering people choice to complete forms at home is really limiting to people who may find those kinds of demands difficult to manage. And then, is there printed information about trauma and healing in that first encounter, in that first situation where a person may be looking for some hint that I'm in the right place? The environment, okay, well, you know, this is not rocket science, but you know, a place needs to be clean and comfortable. There should be space between seats so that if somebody has touch issues, they can be in a space where they're not necessarily back to back or touching arms with the person next to them. That the place somehow reflects the community and the people who are served in that community. That there is some communication, that some things on the walls communicate hope and communicate that healing is possible. And that physical access is well lit and secure. That could be the first kind of look, because if a place feels dangerous because of lighting or because of lack of security, it may deter someone from venturing in. Are the care providers culturally responsive and trauma informed? Is the assessment process streamlined? It's not asking the same questions over and over again, which could be a tremendous stressor for somebody who is a trauma survivor. And that the focus in these first encounters should be on engagement, not completion of forms. And then the issue of voice and feedback. People should be given the opportunity to give feedback on whether their experience was trauma responsive. whether they were treated in a way which made them feel comfortable and which made them feel safe. And then using this data to measure engagement so that we can see the relationship between how people experience the care they're receiving and the rate of missed appointments or the rate of people dropping out of care. So the takeaway here is to focus more on flexibility, compassion, and support in those first encounters rather than being so sort of focused on diagnostic assessment and data collection. I understand that it's important to get as much data as possible, but I think that that should take a second seat or a second place to being present and responding to the individual and what they are saying and what you pick up that they're experiencing. To keep in mind around screening and assessment, again, in order to help people feel that their world is predictable, part of the experience of people who are trauma survivors is that the world doesn't feel predictable. The world feels like a dangerous place. So providing people with information about what to expect is important. That's often achieved by having a participant handbook available for people to understand what the process is and how the place works. If you're going to ask a question, to clarify the reason for asking the question so that it makes sense and giving the person the option not to answer it. Being self-aware, of course, in terms of how a person in the room with the practitioner has an impact on the practitioner. And that sometimes there should be a sensitivity to not probe too deeply, and one has to be kind of aware of when discomfort is observed in the person's in front of you. Try to give as much control of the process by letting the person know what's coming up, or by simply again giving the person the option not to respond or to respond in a different way. And sometimes that is giving the person the respect that they may not want to answer a question in a face-to-face situation, but maybe they would if you gave them the question and they could write down the answer and get it to you in another way. And this would be an example of a self-administered kind of assessment where the person can do this privately and not have to be so exposed in the room with you. Allowing time, not bombarding somebody with a lot of questions. And then that interviewers should be familiar with grounding techniques to help a person if they are beginning to experience distress as a result of some, unintended experience within those screening and assessment interviews. And then making use of resilience scales to understand perhaps whether a person has the ability to manage a certain amount of stress. So again, this is just to kind of amplify how trauma responsiveness has to begin sort of at the front door, because healing begins at the front door. And so these kinds of tips are what would come out of doing that sort of rigorous review of all policies, procedures, and expectations to come up with a trauma responsive way of engaging with people. And I want to say that these issues of access and engagement are really have been repeated in a number of ways. Most recently in terms of our managed care readiness and the triple aim, which has a lot to do, which really has a lot to do. It really emphasizes the experience of care and the health of populations. But the experience of care here, when you're looking at promoting a trauma-responsive experience of care. And I don't think that one can really expect to deliver better health outcomes without this approach to an organization's functioning overall. So let me take us now to sort of a little bit of the basics that we have been doing for the last, I don't know, 20 minutes or so. Okay, so a trauma-responsive culture, in summary, recognizes the high prevalence of trauma, provides services that are consistent, transparent, and predictable, recognizes culture and practices that are re-traumatizing to consumers, and has a willingness to retool themselves to create a culture and a set of practices that are trauma responsive. The last bullet here, I want to just, I didn't get into it too much earlier, but one of the experiences of a person who's experienced trauma is a loss of power and control. And there is a real kind of power imbalance that exists. It exists anyway, but for a person who has experienced trauma, that power imbalance is very frightening. And so we need to understand power and how we as providers may unwittingly kind of express that power, and that may be a way of really alienating people from seeking care. So as providers, we need to be aware of our own power over others that comes with, naturally the provider client relationship, because the provider theoretically is the one who will heal. But in effect, a trauma-responsive organization recognizes that it's a two-way street, and that, again, this is getting back to sort of some of the principles of recovery, that the individual really is the best healer for themselves, and that we're just there to kind of facilitate that healing by providing the tools, perhaps, or the environment within which healing can take place. But we need to be very careful. If we're going to be truly trauma responsive, we have to be very careful of our own showing of power, and we have to believe that we don't really have any power, that we are simply there to facilitate health and to facilitate a person's being achieve optimal health. Moving right along, a trauma-responsive culture is a culture where there's collaboration over compliance. In working with organizations, I try to get them to eliminate the word compliance in terms of speaking about working with individuals, to eliminate it entirely from their vocabulary. Because compliance is, again, a word that's associated with power, and it's much more about collaboration. Again, another hallmark of recovery. Understanding that all behavior has meaning, and working from that vantage point, and that means connecting the dots between a person's experience and a behavior that a person may see, because there's a very strong likelihood that a negative behavior has been triggered by some re-traumatizing experience. Given that to be truly trauma responsive is to avoid at all costs re-traumatization, and certainly re-traumatization that comes from policies, procedures, and approaches that are in themselves re-traumatizing. And I want to say that the ability of giving somebody the power to include people in their lives, in their treatment, is a very important part of trauma responsiveness. We should keep our systems transparent and open to outside parties, because very often those are the protective factors and the resiliency that people have in their lives. And those are the, again, resiliency, thinking about that from a recovery point of view is really being strengths-based. So being sensitive to the need that people have to muster up all the strengths they have, which may include connections to others as part of their healing process. So trauma responsive culture meets the needs of trauma survivors, requires organizations to be trauma informed and responsive, and again means looking at all aspects of management and programming through a trauma responsive lens, constantly keeping in mind how stressful experiences impact both trauma survivors seeking services and the caregivers who deliver services at the organization. The goal of trauma responsive care is to return a sense of control and autonomy to the person. Now, bullets here, important takeaways. A trauma and resilience informed and responsive organization increases safety for all. And again, this brings in the connection between that healing can only occur in a place where everyone feels safe. That includes improving the social environment in a way that focuses on safe relationships, that the organization cares for the caregivers. Again, without a healthy workforce, a healthy caregivers, we cannot deliver services that can help others heal. Continual improvement in the quality of services, every effort to reduce negative encounters and events, creating a community of hope and health, and again back to the workforce, which is at the center of all of this, is increasing success and satisfaction at work. Now, this presentation wouldn't be complete if we didn't think about the value of trauma responsive care in terms of the business of healthcare and how we may interact with our payers in order to deliver important, or rather services, and deliver outcomes that are important to them. So this is a twofold kind of list here. One is one that addresses value, but another one that is allows us to measure the impact of trauma responsive culture. So we can look at baselines before we begin creating the trauma, before we begin becoming a trauma responsive organization, and then looking at those same indicators once we have achieved a certain level of trauma responsiveness. So we could look at the potential reduction in behavioral incidents. If we reduce re-traumatization, potential for re-traumatization, then certainly we are able to look at how being trauma responsive reduces incidents, reducing staff and client injuries as a result of incidents, improved workforce satisfaction, which then leads to a decrease in workforce stress related to absenteeism. So these are things that really have an impact on our limited resources. Staff turnover, if we can decrease staff turnover, not only do we improve continuity of care, but we also reduce the expense associated with recruitment and basic training, which allows us to have more training dollars to implement other best practices. Improve client satisfaction and engagement. So this is the experience of care. People who feel more satisfied and engaged with their treatment, with the services that you provide, are people who will remain in care and therefore will have fewer missed appointments, will have fewer incidences of premature drop out of care, will then result, hopefully, in improved health outcomes. And that, at the end of the day, positions us all better as organization to engage in value-based contracting. So I always urge the providers I work with to kind of look at this, and becoming trauma responsive requires a lot of effort. It requires a lot of time. It requires a lot of dedication. It requires a certain amount of financial investment. And so if you're going to do all that, you want to see something more concretely. You want to see a change that you can sort of measure, that you can look at and say, hey, because we did this, look at the changes in these. And these are some of the dimensions. I'm sure there are others, but certainly these are the ones that clearly one can connect with becoming more trauma responsive. And so that's it for me. Q&A now, Daniela.
Yes, we've got tons of questions coming in. We also had quite a nice conversation in the chat box that I would like to hopefully get to sort of give you a summation of, so you can chime in on that as well. So let's get to some of the questions first. The first is, how do you address organizational culture or leadership that's made up of people with lived experience but is resistant to treating staff in a trauma responsive lens?
Can you repeat that? That has a lot of, yeah.
I know, yeah. So how do you address an organization's culture or leadership that's made up of people with lived experience that's resistant to treating staff in a trauma responsive way?
Oh, well, I think I get it now. I think that it really has to do with education. I mean, I think it really has to do with helping those people with lived experience. That when it comes to trauma, I don't think that there is anybody that doesn't have lived experience. I mean, if you've lived long enough, everybody's on the same kind of place. I mean, you look at what's happening now. I mean, we're all living the experience of COVID. People to kind of break down those us and them. I think it's getting people to understand that we live in a traumatizing world, and we've all been exposed to trauma, and we're all trying to, in one way or another, and that's sort of another way of saying finding the common ground. That we're all on a continuum, we're all trauma survivors.
All right, awesome. Next question is about another question on integration. So how do you suggest integrating the experience of discrimination and stigma into trauma work?
It's there. I mean, I didn't get into it in the presentation, but discrimination, oppression are all trauma inducing. And that would be another presentation and another hour or so to really get into this whole notion of how we are living in a world which traumatizes, in particular, any group, and I hate to use even that word, but anyone who is sort of on the margins whether it's people who have criminal justice involvement, uh, are much more prone to having experienced trauma and are much more exposed to being re-traumatized. The same goes for the LGBT community that are at higher risk, and certainly goes without saying that people of color who live in our cities and in our states and who are marginalized by reason of poverty, for example. So I think that this idea of stigma or oppression applies, and if one is going to have a really comprehensive understanding of trauma, one can't avoid but include that in the discussion.
And then I just, in the last couple minutes, because we really only have about a minute or two left, I would like for you to sort of join in the conversation that's been happening in the chat box. So we had lots of discussion back and forth in the chat box about self-care, and I'm wondering if you wanted to speak on the relationship of self-care and how that sort of, how self-care is involved in creating a trauma-responsive organization.
Yeah, absolutely. So I don't know when you went. I guess should I just ask people in the group to speak directly to me, or do you want me to kind of give an answer?
Well, I think folks have been sort of chatting back and forth with each other about what they're doing for self-care and how self-care is important to them, and I'm just wondering if you wanted to sort of chime in on that.
Yes. Yes. So I pointed out in a number of places in my presentation about the importance of the workforce and how an organization that's really trauma responsive attends to that and is very sort of intentional about self-care for the workforce. And there's a whole host of information around that, but certainly on a very kind of sort of superficial level, without going into depth. If you look at trauma-informed supervision, what does trauma-responsive supervision look like? Where it's recognizing that the person who is providing the care may be stressed out, for lack of a better word, and may need time off. And so, or may need some kind of intervention themselves. And so that supervision in itself should be looking at how the individuals who are being supervised are caring for themselves. And then the organization providing resources for its workforce for self-care. And some of it could be things that they do themselves. So for example, I know an organization that has a yoga instructor that comes to the organization twice a month. And that spends the whole day there and allows people to come in for yoga sessions. And by the way, in one organization, they have the yoga sessions consisting of staff and the clients in the program doing it together. So there could be sort of these concrete things, but self-care is something that needs to be promoted as part of the culture of the organization, that the organization offers flexibility in scheduling, for example, or flexibility in how people use their time, and then offers, you know, I have one organization that just puts out a self-care newsletter every month that has a whole host of things that they offer or that other people offer. I can't, you know, this is such an important part of being trauma responsive, because without a healthy workforce, and then one of the nice things that also happens is as the workforce begins to care for themselves, they're able to impart that to the clients. Is that parallel process where then if they learn things about self-care, they can then communicate that to the people they serve in a ways that then, you know, what a great way to kind of engage with someone and participate in a relaxation exercise together. The self-care issue is huge. I hope
Right,
hope
awesome.
that was helpful.
That was great. Thank you, Eve. So I just wanted to wrap things up. It's about 12:59, so we have literally less than a minute left. So I just want to say thank you to Eve for leading us in this discussion this afternoon. I also want to let folks know who are still on the line. I've put the link for the closing remarks in the chat box. So all you need to do is copy and paste that into your browser. And then we'll be joining the other workshop. Probably they're probably finishing up right about now. And then Harvey and Len will be joining that workshop and giving closing remarks for executive seminar. So with that,
Okay,
I just want to say thank you
Daniela?
all for joining.
Yeah,
Yep.
Daniela, I want to say thank you to you for helping me do this today.
You got it, Eve. Thanks, everyone. We'll see you back at the other room in a few minutes.
Bye-bye.